Edward Langston had always believed he could buy anything: land, status, even loyalty. But that belief had a limit, and it showed the day he made the cruelest decision of his life. Isaiah, his most loyal servant, the man who had raised his children, managed the household, and labored in the fields without complaint, was about to be sold. And Edward did it without a second thought. Isaiah had spent decades serving the Langston family. He had taught the children their letters, guided them through the cotton fields, and been the quiet anchor in the household. Everyone who knew Isaiah respected him for his strength and his loyalty. Yet to Edward all of that meant nothing. Isaiah was property, a man whose years of service could be converted into immediate cash. Margaret Langston, Edward's daughter, understood exactly what was happening. She had watched Isaiah for years, seen his kindness, his dignity, his patience, and now she could only watch as her father prepared to destroy the man's life. "Father, you can't," she whispered one morning, catching Edward as he reviewed the documents. "He's done everything for us, everything. You can't just sell him." Edward looked at her without emotion. "This isn't about feelings, Margaret. It's about survival. Business requires money, and Isaiah, he's the solution. He will go to another plantation, far from here, and serve there, forever." Her hands trembled. "Forever? Do you even see what you're doing? He's loyal. He's part of this family." Edward's jaw tightened. "Loyalty doesn't pay debts. I need the money now, not memories. That is the only thing that matters." The house went silent as the servants overheard. Even those accustomed to Edward's harshness felt a shiver at the cruelty of this choice. Isaiah, when summoned, could not immediately comprehend the words. He had expected orders, work, maybe even punishment for minor mistakes, but never this. "Sir, you—" Isaiah's voice broke, a mix of disbelief and hurt. "I've given everything. My life, my loyalty, and this is how you repay me?" Edward's gaze was icy. "This is business, Isaiah. You will leave and you will serve elsewhere. That is final. Your feelings do not change that." Isaiah's chest tightened, but he said nothing more. He had been taught too long to obey, too long to hide the depth of his despair. His eyes met Margaret's one last time, a silent plea, a mixture of sorrow and understanding. She wanted to reach out to stop him, but could not. The power dynamics of the world were too heavy, and the law too rigid. By the next morning, Isaiah's few belongings were packed. Each item, a small reminder of the life he had known, was soon to be lost. Every step toward the carriage felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted his leaving. The children he had nurtured, the fields he had tended, the home he had called his own, everything would be gone. The weight of Edward's cruelty pressed on him like a physical force. As Isaiah was led toward the carriage, whispers ran through the other slaves. They had never seen loyalty punished in such a public way. Fear, disbelief, and anger mingled on their faces. Edward, however, remained unmoved. In his mind, the problem had been solved. Money was secured, debts would be paid, and life would continue. Isaiah climbed onto the carriage, casting one last glance at the plantation, the house, the familiar fields. The children who had once run to greet him all belonged to someone else now. The world he had known for decades vanished in a single day. And yet he carried himself with a quiet dignity, refusing to give Edward the satisfaction of seeing him broken completely. The journey to the new plantation was grueling. Each mile pulled him farther from his past and closer to a future filled with uncertainty. Strangers surrounded him. Overseers barked orders, their eyes cold and unforgiving. Isaiah, who had once been a cornerstone of a household, was now treated as nothing more than property. Every command, every task, every mile reinforced the betrayal. Back at the Langston estate, Edward attempted to convince himself of his cleverness. The money he had gained was immediate and tangible. The debt that had threatened him was now gone. But as he walked through the empty halls of his house, he felt an unfamiliar weight. The place felt colder, quieter. Rooms that once echoed with laughter now felt hollow. The void Isaiah had left could not be filled with gold. Margaret could not sleep. She wandered the house at night, thinking of Isaiah, his quiet strength, the guidance he had given her brothers, the lessons he had taught her, the patience he had shown her, anger at her father twisted with sorrow for Isaiah, and a helplessness that made her feel small and powerless. She wondered if her father had ever felt a pang of conscience. Meanwhile, Isaiah arrived at the distant plantation. The new overseers were harsh, the work unrelenting, fields stretched endlessly. Overseers shouted without mercy, and there was no corner of respite. Yet Isaiah endured, clinging to the dignity he refused to surrender. Each day reminded him of Edward's betrayal, but also revealed a hidden strength within him, a resilience born of injustice. Edward, despite his wealth, began to feel an unexpected unease. Nights became restless. Each room, each empty chair, each echo of a laugh once carried by. Isaiah's presence reminded him of the cost of his greed. Money could not replace loyalty. Gold could not erase the weight of betrayal. Weeks passed and letters came from Isaiah. They described hardship and survival, resilience and sorrow, and the subtle dignity that Isaiah maintained despite cruelty. Edward read the letters with growing dread. The wealth he had gained began to feel meaningless, hollow, a reminder of the trust he had destroyed. Even his neighbors noticed. Edward's reputation had always been tied to wealth, but the cruelty of his action left a stain no amount of money could erase. In public he maintained his composure, but in private regret gnawed at him. Every glance at Margaret's face, every memory of Isaiah's loyal service, brought guilt that wealth could not buy away. For Isaiah, life continued harsh and unforgiving, but he drew strength from his memories of the Langston household, from the dignity he had preserved, and from the loyalty he had given freely. Every day reminded him of the injustice done, but also the inner fortitude it had forced him to discover. The plantation where Isaiah now worked offered no comfort. The overseers were crueler, the fields endless, and the nights lonelier than he could have imagined. Yet in the quiet moments, when the work paused, when the sun dipped low, he thought of the Langston home not with longing, but with a fierce determination to survive, to endure, and to remember the betrayal that had marked his life forever. And Edward? Every coin he earned, every crop harvested under his name, brought a hollow victory. He had gained wealth but lost peace. The face of Isaiah haunted him, a silent reproach that no amount of money or status could silence. Margaret, too, could not forgive, could not forget. And slowly, Edward Langston began to realize that cruelty may provide immediate gain, but regret, deep, lasting, unforgiving regret, was a debt far heavier than any he could pay in gold. Isaiah's first weeks at the new plantation were worse than he had feared. The overseers barked commands like dogs, never giving a moment's pause. Fields stretched endlessly, the cotton like a sea of needles pressing against his hands. Every task reminded him of Edward's betrayal. The home he had built with sweat and loyalty now belonged to a man who valued money over a lifetime of service. At night, Isaiah lay on the hard floor of his new quarters, exhaustion pressing on him like a weight. He thought of the Langston household, the children's laughter, the quiet dignity of Margaret, the small comforts of a home that had once been his world. Those memories hurt more than any whip, more than any sore muscle. And yet in the quiet, a spark of determination remained. He would survive. He had no choice. Back in Louisiana, Edward Langston tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the emptiness of the house gnawed at him. Meals felt hollow. The laughter of children seemed faint, almost mocking. The servants moved efficiently. But the absence of Isaiah, their backbone, was obvious in every room. Edward had the money he had wanted, yet each coin felt like a reminder of the cruelty he had committed. Margaret continued to watch him with a wary sadness. She had tried to speak to her father, tried to make him see the human cost of his actions. But Edward refused to hear it. "I did what I had to do," he said. "The rest is irrelevant." But Margaret could see the cracks forming, the first signs of guilt creeping into the man who had always prided himself on control. Isaiah, meanwhile, learned quickly to navigate his new reality. The overseers were harsh, but he discovered that small acts of intelligence and quiet resistance could preserve a fragment of dignity. He worked tirelessly, never breaking, never losing the quiet pride that had defined him for decades. Fellow slaves began to notice him, some with admiration, others with envy, but all with recognition that Isaiah was unbroken. Weeks turned into months. The Langston plantation continued to produce wealth, yet Edward's satisfaction dwindled. Letters from Isaiah arrived sporadically, each one a mix of endurance and sorrow. The words struck Edward deeper than he anticipated. Isaiah survived. Yes, but the resilience and quiet, dignity he displayed were constant, reminders of the betrayal. Edward began to feel a gnawing unease, a moral reckoning he could not escape. The neighbors began to whisper too. Edward Langston's wealth was still impressive, but the cruelty of selling a loyal man was hard to ignore. Social invitations became rare. Casual conversations carried a sharp edge of judgment. Edward maintained appearances, but inwardly every glance at Margaret, every memory of Isaiah's faithful service, weighed heavily on him. At the new plantation, Isaiah endured countless indignities. Overseers demanded work that seemed impossible. Punishments were harsh and often unjust, and the nights were cold and lonely. Yet Isaiah remained steadfast. He drew strength from the memories of the Langston household, from the knowledge that he had once given everything to a man who had betrayed him. Survival became an act of silent defiance. Back home, Edward tried to immerse himself in new business ventures, seeking distraction in the endless pursuit of profit. But every contract, every ledger, every coin in the chest reminded him of what he had lost. Money could solve his debts, but it could not undo the moral damage. Each night he would hear Isaiah's imagined voice echoing in his mind, a constant accusation he could neither escape nor answer. Margaret's presence became a mirror for Edward's conscience. Her quiet observations, the way she looked at him with disappointment and sorrow, forced him to confront the consequences of his cruelty. Even she, powerless as a daughter in the rigid social order, became a symbol of the humanity Edward had forsaken. Isaiah, despite the hardships, began to forge small victories. He found ways to ease the burden on the fellow slaves, sharing knowledge of work patterns, teaching them subtle skills that would improve their daily lives, and offering quiet encouragement. Even in the face of cruelty, he retained a moral strength that Edward had never recognized until it was too late. Months passed, and the Langston plantation continued to thrive financially. Yet Edward's evenings were filled with unease, insomnia, and guilt. He walked the halls of his grand house alone, hearing echoes of Isaiah's footsteps in his memory, recalling the quiet loyalty that had been the true foundation of his home. Every coin earned was tainted with the knowledge of what had been lost. One afternoon a letter arrived from Isaiah, carried by a distant messenger. The handwriting was careful, precise, reflecting the resilience of the man who had once devoted his life to the Langston family. Isaiah wrote of survival, of endurance, and of the relentless hardships he faced. But beneath the words lay a quiet dignity, a moral fortitude that contrasted sharply with the greed and cruelty of Edward Langston. Reading the letter, Edward felt a sharp pang in his chest. The man he had betrayed, the man he had sold for profit, still carried himself with honor. And Edward, wealthy, powerful, respected, felt a hollowness he could not fill. Money had solved immediate problems, but loyalty lost could never be restored. The full weight of regret settled over him, heavier than any debt he had ever owed. Margaret watched her father during these days. She saw the change, subtle but undeniable, the arrogance, the confidence, the unyielding pride, all chipped away by the moral cost of cruelty. She did not pity him, but she recognized the beginning of reckoning. She had hoped he would see the human cost earlier, but perhaps recognition, even late, was better than none. Isaiah, meanwhile, found moments of quiet resistance. He endured the cruelty of the overseers with patience, helped his fellow slaves in small, significant ways, and preserved his sense of self. Each day was a battle, but he never surrendered. The dignity that had defined him before Edward's betrayal. Even in isolation, he became a silent symbol of endurance. Edward tried distraction again. Business ventures, investments, social events, but nothing removed the nagging weight of regret. Every evening, as he sat alone in the grand hall, memories of Isaiah haunted him. The echo of loyalty, the betrayal, and the injustice replayed in his mind like a relentless drum. Wealth could not erase conscience. Money could not restore trust. Margaret often spoke to him, sometimes softly, sometimes with quiet firmness. "Father, you must understand," she would say. "Some debts are not paid with money. Some wrongs leave scars that last a lifetime." Edward would nod, but his pride resisted full acknowledgement. Yet deep inside he knew she was right. Meanwhile, at the distant plantation, Isaiah's resilience began to inspire others. The cruel overseers could break bodies but not spirit. He became a quiet leader among the slaves, teaching them survival, endurance, and the power of inner dignity. Though far from home, his moral strength became a beacon, a reminder that cruelty could not crush the human soul entirely. Weeks turned into months. Edward's wealth grew, but so did the emptiness. Each harvest, each transaction, reminded him of what he had sold. Each interaction with neighbors reminded him that cruelty leaves marks far beyond the immediate victim. Even the social respect he once commanded felt tainted. Isaiah never forgot the Langston family, nor the betrayal he had suffered. He endured, as he always had, with quiet strength and dignity. His letters were careful, never revealing weakness, yet conveying a truth. Edward could not escape. Loyalty and morality are worth more than wealth, and betrayal carries a price heavier than gold. Edward could no longer ignore it. The man he had sold for profit was alive, strong, and dignified, a living reminder of Edward's own moral failure. And while Isaiah survived and adapted, Edward was trapped in a prison of guilt, regret, and a slowly growing understanding that cruelty brings no lasting reward. Isaiah had been at the distant plantation for nearly a year now. The work was brutal, the overseers unrelenting, and the fields endless. Yet he endured. Every morning he rose with the sun, pushing his body to its limits, but never letting the cruelty break his spirit. In secret, he offered guidance to other slaves, teaching them how to survive the harsh labor, how to avoid the overseer's wrath, and how to preserve a shred of dignity even in chains. Every night Isaiah thought of the Langston household, of the children he had helped raise, of Margaret's kind eyes. The memory was painful, a constant reminder of what Edward had done, but it also fueled a determination to endure. He could not change what had happened, but he could control how he faced the cruelty imposed upon him. Back at the Langston plantation, Edward's initial relief over selling Isaiah had long vanished. Every coin earned felt hollow. The house, once full of life and laughter, now echoed with emptiness. Meals were quiet. Rooms that had once held joy now seemed shadows of themselves. The presence of Isaiah had been the soul of the household, and no amount of wealth could replace it. Margaret watched her father closely. She noticed the subtle changes in him. His walks were slower, his voice occasionally caught in hesitation, his eyes distant. The arrogance and cruelty that had defined Edward Langston were giving way to regret, though he would never openly admit it. She had hoped that he might see the human cost earlier, but even now, she understood that recognition, even delayed, was a small mercy. Isaiah's letters reached Edward sporadically. Each one detailed the harsh conditions, the long hours, the constant supervision, and yet, beneath every word was a quiet dignity. Isaiah survived, endured, and maintained his integrity. The contrast between the man's unwavering character and Edward's own moral failure struck Edward harder than any loss of money could. Neighbors began to murmur. Edward's wealth remained, but the cruelty of selling a loyal man became part of the community's quiet conversation. Invitations grew fewer, and even casual encounters carried subtle judgment. Edward could hide his financial status, but he could not hide the moral stain of his actions. Isaiah, despite the relentless labor, began to influence those around him. The other slaves noticed his resilience, his patience, his careful strategies to ease daily burdens. He became a quiet leader, a source of inspiration. Though he had lost his home, he had not lost his spirit. He taught survival not through defiance, but through calm, endurance, and subtle guidance, a form of resistance that the overseers could not touch. Edward attempted to distract himself with new business ventures, investments, land purchases, and expanding the plantation's output all demanded his attention. Yet each success brought only a fleeting satisfaction, immediately replaced by the gnawing weight of regret. Every coin, every acre, reminded him that the loyalty he had destroyed was priceless. Wealth had not bought peace, it had only deepened his conscience's burden. Margaret's presence in Edward's life became a constant mirror. She spoke rarely but effectively. "Some debts," she said one evening, "cannot be repaid with money. Some wrongs leave scars that last a lifetime." Edward nodded silently, understanding the truth in her words. But pride still restrained his full admission. Still, deep inside, he knew she was right. Isaiah adapted to the harsh life with a quiet strength. He endured the overseer's cruelty with patience, helped fellow slaves navigate their suffering, and preserved a sense of moral dignity. Each day was a challenge, but he refused to surrender to despair. His endurance became a subtle form of defiance, a statement that cruelty could never entirely crush the human soul. Weeks turned into months. Edward's wealth grew, but so did the emptiness in his home. Every harvest, every transaction reminded him of what he had sold. Every interaction with neighbors reminded him of the moral cost of his actions. Respect and influence remained, but they were tainted by the knowledge of the cruelty he had committed. Isaiah never forgot the Langston family, nor the betrayal that had cast him into a harsher world. He endured with quiet fortitude, drawing strength from the memories of loyalty, kindness, and moral integrity that Edward had dismissed. Survival became an act of resilience, a refusal to allow cruelty to define him completely. Edward could no longer escape the weight of conscience. The man he had sold for profit, the man who had served faithfully for decades, lived with dignity and strength, a living testament to Edward's moral failure. Meanwhile, Edward remained haunted. Each coin earned a reminder of the human cost of greed. Margaret continued to speak when she could, often softly, sometimes with a firmness that pierced Edward's defenses. "Father," she said once, "wealth is nothing if the price is the loss of conscience. The damage you've done will not disappear with time or money." Edward remained silent, but inwardly, the truth settled heavily. The letters from Isaiah, the whispers from neighbors, the quiet sorrow in Margaret's eyes, all combined into an inescapable reckoning. Isaiah's influence among the other slaves continued to grow. His calm leadership and quiet acts of guidance inspired hope. He demonstrated that dignity, patience, and wisdom could survive even in the harshest conditions. Despite being removed from his home and everything familiar, Isaiah became a symbol of endurance, teaching others to navigate cruelty without surrendering the soul. Edward, on the other hand, saw his house empty even in its fullest moments. Wealth could not fill the void left by Isaiah. Laughter had no warmth, conversation no depth. Every ledger, every new business deal, was a reminder that cruelty has consequences beyond immediate gain. The moral debt he owed, Isaiah and his own family pressed upon him like a chain he could not break. Months stretched into a year. Isaiah's work remained grueling, but he found small victories in guiding the younger slaves, teaching them small efficiencies, and quietly resisting total submission. Every act of endurance reminded him that Edward's cruelty had failed to destroy his spirit. Each night, as he rested his weary body, he carried a quiet pride. The betrayal had tested him, but it had not conquered him. Edward's regret deepened. Every moment alone in the house, every empty room, every glance at Margaret, reminded him of Isaiah's unwavering loyalty and the cost of his betrayal. Wealth had been acquired, yes, but it was hollow. The moral consequences could not be erased. Margaret continued to witness the change. Her father's pride slowly eroded, replaced with subtle guilt and unease. She understood that cruelty might yield immediate gain, but regret was relentless, unforgiving, and far heavier than any debt Edward had once feared. Isaiah's presence at the new plantation became a quiet force. He endured injustice, helped others, and preserved his integrity. His life, though harsh, became a testament to resilience. Edward, in contrast, could not escape the psychological weight of his decisions. The man he had sold survived with dignity, while Edward remained haunted by the consequences of his cruelty. Every letter from Isaiah carried the subtle proof of his endurance and moral strength. Every note reminded Edward that betrayal comes with a lasting cost. Wealth had been earned, but respect, loyalty, and peace could not be bought or replaced. Edward began to see clearly the truth he had long avoided. The real value of a human life cannot be measured in gold, and cruelty leaves a debt far heavier than any money could repay. By the second year at the distant plantation, Isaiah had settled into a grim routine. The overseers were as relentless as ever, the fields unending, the days long and punishing. Every lash of the whip, every shouted command, reminded him of Edward Langston's betrayal, the man who had sold him for money, the man he had once served faithfully. But Isaiah refused to break. He endured not out of hope for reward, but out of a stubborn insistence that cruelty could not take away his dignity. Isaiah's quiet acts of leadership began to ripple through the plantation. Younger slaves looked to him for guidance, learning which paths through the fields minimized punishment, how to anticipate the overseer's moods, and how to survive the endless demands without losing themselves entirely. He shared knowledge carefully, subtly, and always with discretion. His moral strength was contagious. Even in chains, he remained a beacon of resilience. Meanwhile, Edward Langston's wealth continued to grow, but so did his internal torment. Nights were the worst. He walked the halls of the grand house alone, haunted by memory. Every room seemed emptier, every echo louder. Meals felt hollow. He had gained the money he sought, but at what cost? Loyalty had been destroyed, and conscience demanded payment in full. Margaret observed her father quietly. She noted the subtle changes, the tension in his jaw, the hesitation in his voice, the distant look in his eyes. Pride had been replaced slowly by guilt. Yet Edward still maintained his mask of authority in public, refusing to admit fully the moral failure that weighed on him. Margaret's heart ached, knowing that awareness had come too late to save Isaiah, but perhaps not too late to change her father's remaining life. Isaiah's letters continued to arrive sporadically, smuggled by sympathetic messengers. Each one described endurance, hardship, and subtle victories in the daily struggle. Yet underlying every sentence was a quiet dignity, a refusal to allow cruelty to define him. Edward read each letter with mounting unease. Isaiah survived, thrived morally, and retained a strength that Edward could not diminish with wealth or power. Neighbors began to whisper more frequently. Edward Langston's fortune was still impressive, but the story of selling a loyal servant for money had spread. Invitations to social gatherings declined. Casual conversations carried judgment, and respect was tinged with disapproval. Edward could maintain appearances, but the moral stain of his cruelty followed him relentlessly. Isaiah, despite the brutal labor and constant oversight, began to inspire subtle change. Other slaves observed his patience, his methods of surviving cruelty, and his calm leadership. They learned to endure, to resist in small, meaningful ways. Isaiah's influence was invisible to the overseers, but powerful among those who suffered daily. Even in isolation, he had become a quiet symbol of resilience. Edward attempted distraction again, investing in land, expanding his operations, and pursuing new ventures, yet nothing alleviated the gnawing guilt. Each success reminded him of Isaiah's absence. Each ledger carried the weight of betrayal. Wealth could not restore loyalty. Money could not repair conscience. Every coin, every acre, every new investment reminded him that cruelty comes with an unavoidable cost. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. Some debts cannot be repaid with money, she had said. Some wrongs leave scars that last a lifetime. Edward could no longer ignore the truth. Letters from Isaiah, whispers from neighbors, and the sorrowful looks of his daughter all reminded him that moral failure was inescapable. Isaiah's life at the new plantation was relentless. Overseers demanded constant labor, punishments were cruel, and the nights were long and lonely. Yet he endured, preserving his dignity. Every act of survival was also an act of defiance. He refused to allow Edward's betrayal to define him. In secret, he helped others, sharing knowledge of survival, teaching patience, and maintaining a sense of humanity in the harshest conditions. Edward's home remained wealthy but empty. Laughter was hollow, conversations shallow, and authority meaningless. Without the man who had once given the household its foundation, every successful transaction, every coin gained, reminded him of the moral cost of his actions. Wealth could not buy peace, nor could it erase the knowledge of betrayal. Months turned into a second year. Isaiah's resilience became legendary among the slaves. His quiet leadership, patience, and moral strength inspired hope. He had been uprooted, betrayed, and forced into cruelty's harshest conditions, yet he remained unbroken. Every day of endurance reaffirmed his inner power, a stark contrast to Edward's growing remorse. Edward felt the weight of regret deepen. Every moment alone in the house, every empty room, every glance at Margaret, reminded him of Isaiah's loyalty and the price of his betrayal. The money he had gained could not replace the trust he had destroyed. The moral consequences were relentless, and he began to understand that cruelty might bring immediate gain. But regret was a far heavier burden than any debt. Margaret continued to observe quietly, offering guidance through small words and gestures. "Father," she said, "the weight of cruelty cannot be escaped. You may gain wealth, but the cost will follow you forever." Edward nodded, understanding, but pride still held him back from a full admission. Deep inside he knew she was right, and that knowledge was becoming harder to bear each day. Isaiah's presence at the new plantation continued to influence others. He endured injustice with dignity, offered subtle guidance, and became a moral anchor for those around him. Though far from home, he proved that cruelty could not destroy the human spirit. Each day was a reminder that Edward's greed had failed to conquer the man he had betrayed. Edward, despite wealth and status, found no comfort. Empty rooms, hollow laughter, and Margaret's silent disapproval reminded him daily of the consequences of his actions. The letters from Isaiah, the whispers of neighbors, and the empty presence in the house created a moral reckoning he could not escape. Every coin earned, every new business venture undertaken, carried the weight of cruelty and betrayal. Isaiah's quiet leadership became more apparent over time. He guided the young slaves, offered advice to preserve dignity under harsh conditions, and maintained his integrity despite relentless adversity. Edward watched from afar, reading letters that detailed Isaiah's endurance and moral strength. The man he had sold lived with honor, while Edward remained trapped by his conscience, haunted by regret. By the end of the second year, the contrast was undeniable. Isaiah, though enslaved and far from home, retained his dignity and influenced those around him. Edward, wealthy beyond measure, lived in isolation, haunted by the consequences of his cruelty. Loyalty had been destroyed for money, but regret could not be bought away. Every night, Edward felt Isaiah's absence in every corner of the house, in every empty hallway, and in every conversation that once included the man he had betrayed. Isaiah had now spent nearly 2 years at the distant plantation. Life was harsh, the overseers relentless, the labor unending. Yet through it all, he maintained the quiet dignity that had defined him, even in his darkest days. Every day brought a new challenge, a field larger than the last, a task more exhausting, a whip more threatening. Yet Isaiah endured because he had no choice, and because he refused to surrender the strength of his spirit. The other slaves began to notice him in ways they hadn't before. They watched how he managed tasks efficiently, how he avoided the wrath of the overseers without compromising his own sense of morality, and how he quietly helped those weaker or newer to the plantation survive. Some whispered encouragement to each other, saying, "Follow Isaiah's lead. Watch him learn, survive." In this subtle way, Isaiah became a leader, a symbol of resilience, and even a source of hope in a world built entirely on cruelty. Back at the Langston household, Edward felt the void of Isaiah's absence more sharply than ever. Money had solved his immediate problems, but the man he had sold could not be replaced. The house felt empty, the laughter of children hollow, and the quiet efficiency that Isaiah had brought to every corner of daily life vanished with him. Edward tried to fill the silence with more business ventures, more transactions, more land, more wealth, but each addition brought no relief. Instead, it reminded him of the cost of his cruelty. Margaret observed her father closely. She had long since realized that Edward was beginning to understand the consequences of his actions, though he would never admit it aloud. "Some debts," she whispered one evening, "cannot be repaid with money. Some wrongs leave scars that last a lifetime." Edward nodded silently, staring at the floor. In private, he felt the weight of regret crushing him. Though he continued to maintain the mask of authority in public, letters from Isaiah continued to arrive, carefully delivered by messengers sympathetic to him. In them, Isaiah spoke of survival, hardship, and the subtle victories he had claimed over adversity. He wrote of small ways he had helped fellow slaves navigate the cruelty of overseers, preserve their dignity, and endure without surrendering entirely. Every line reminded Edward that Isaiah had survived, had preserved his moral strength, and had even influenced others, despite being uprooted and betrayed. Edward read these letters with a growing unbearable awareness. Each one highlighted the contrast between Isaiah's endurance and his own moral failure. He had wealth, yes, but he could not escape the constant reminder of what he had lost: loyalty, trust, and the peace that comes from knowing one has done right. Every day, Edward felt the emptiness of the house and the moral consequences of his choices pressing down on him. Margaret often watched him silently, knowing that her father's regret was real. Sometimes she asked pointed questions. "Do you ever wonder what he feels, Father? Do you ever imagine how he suffers far from home?" Edward's answers were evasive, but he could not escape the truth. Cruelty brings temporary gain, but its shadow lasts far longer than gold or land. Meanwhile, Isaiah continued to survive, not just physically but morally. He guided the younger slaves, taught them small lessons in efficiency and safety, and helped them endure the daily abuse of overseers without losing hope. His quiet leadership created a ripple effect across the plantation. Whispers of encouragement passed from one worker to another. "Watch Isaiah. He knows the way. He survives, and you can too." In this way, Isaiah's resilience became a lifeline for many, a silent rebellion against the cruelty that surrounded them. Edward, despite wealth and status, could find no joy. He walked through the empty rooms of the house, listened to the faint echoes of laughter that Isaiah had once fostered, and felt the weight of moral debt grow heavier with every passing day. No business success, no land acquisition, no coin earned could restore what he had destroyed. He realized painfully that cruelty may offer immediate benefit, but it leaves a permanent mark. Margaret decided to speak more directly to him one afternoon. "Father, you may have wealth, but can you buy back loyalty? Can you replace trust? Can you restore a man's dignity that you sold for money?" Edward turned his gaze to the window, silent, but Margaret could see the shame in his posture. The first seeds of true regret were taking root. Isaiah, meanwhile, had begun to observe the subtleties of his new environment. He saw the jealousy, the fear, and the exhaustion of those around him. He began to teach them how to endure, not through defiance, which would bring more pain, but through patience, foresight, and quiet resistance. Every day, he maintained his own dignity and helped others preserve theirs. His moral strength shone brighter in adversity, a quiet reminder that cruelty cannot extinguish the human spirit entirely. The letters Edward received continued to reinforce this truth. Isaiah wrote of survival, small victories, and the quiet endurance of those around him. Edward read them with mounting unease, realizing that the man he had sold was thriving morally, while he himself suffered the consequences of his own cruelty. The contrast could not be ignored. Margaret watched her father closely. She had come to understand that Edward's conscience could not be silenced. The moral cost of cruelty was exacting a toll on him, even if he did not admit it openly. She spoke carefully, softly, at times leaving questions that forced reflection. "Have you considered how his life continues without you? Have you thought about the lessons he teaches now, lessons you destroyed?" Edward remained silent, but the weight of truth settled on him nonetheless. At the distant plantation, Isaiah's quiet acts of leadership became more influential. He helped organize work in ways that reduced punishment for others, instructed new arrivals on survival strategies, and demonstrated that dignity could be maintained even under relentless cruelty. His example inspired hope among those around him. Some dared to comment quietly in whispered tones, "Isaiah endures. We can too." These words spread, forming a network of silent resilience among the enslaved workers. Edward, wealthy but increasingly haunted, began to isolate himself further. The house seemed emptier with each passing day. Meals were quiet, conversations strained. The moral consequences of his actions were unavoidable. Every time he sought Margaret, he was reminded of Isaiah's loyalty and the irreparable damage caused by his own choices. At times, Margaret asked the questions viewers would have asked if they were in the room. "Father, if you could do it over, would you still have sold him?" Edward could not answer. The truth was unbearable. He had chosen profit over loyalty. Cruelty over conscience, and the weight of that decision followed him constantly. Isaiah's influence continued to grow in subtle ways. He helped others preserve dignity, survive the harsh labor, and maintain hope despite relentless adversity. He became a living example of resilience, endurance, and moral strength. The very man Edward had sold for immediate profit had become a figure of inspiration for many. Edward's regret deepened. The house remained full of wealth, yet empty of life and meaning. Letters from Isaiah, whispers from neighbors, and Margaret's quiet disapproval became constant reminders. That cruelty leaves a permanent mark. Each day Edward realized more clearly that wealth could not erase moral debt. For viewers watching this story unfold, moments like these naturally raise reflection. How far would you go for profit? What is the cost of betraying loyalty? Isaiah's resilience invites admiration, while Edward's regret reminds us that cruelty carries lasting consequences. If you feel the injustice, if you empathize with Isaiah, take a moment to like this story. If you have thoughts about Edward's choices, leave a comment, share your perspective. Isaiah's journey continued quietly, morally intact, and increasingly influential to those around him. Edward, by contrast, lived each day weighed down by guilt and regret. The stark contrast between endurance in the face of cruelty and the burden of moral failure formed the central lesson of this story. Cruelty may gain money, but regret gains the heart. Isaiah had now settled into the rhythm of life at the distant plantation. Though settled, meant nothing more than learning to endure. Each morning began before sunrise, the overseer's shouts carrying across the fields as the enslaved workers moved in strict lines, performing back-breaking labor. Cotton plants tore at Isaiah's hands, and the sun pressed down without mercy. Yet he moved with a measured strength, refusing to let the cruelty define him. The younger slaves quickly learned to observe him. His patience, his calculated movements, and his careful avoidance of unnecessary punishment became a silent lesson in endurance. Isaiah helped them in subtle ways, guiding hands, quietly showing how to avoid the overseer's notice, how to ration strength, and how to survive the day without surrendering all dignity. He had no illusions about freedom, but he had not lost his humanity, and that became his quiet rebellion. Weeks passed. The overseers were as cruel as ever, punishing minor mistakes with lashes or prolonged labor. Yet Isaiah endured with a resilience that quietly unsettled them. They could not break his spirit, and they began to view him with a mixture of irritation and grudging respect. To them he was simply property, but they could see that this property carried a quiet force no whip could conquer. Back in Louisiana, Edward Langston's wealth continued to grow, yet the emptiness of his home became ever more apparent. Rooms were full of furniture, tables piled with documents, and coin was abundant, but life itself had left. He walked the halls alone, hearing echoes that no longer carried laughter. Meals were eaten in silence. Every memory of Isaiah and the loyalty he had destroyed seemed to press upon him, reminding him that cruelty may gain money, but it cannot recover conscience. Margaret continued to observe her father. She noticed the subtle changes, the tension in his posture, the occasional sigh that betrayed his discomfort, the distant look in his eyes. His pride remained in public, but the weight of regret had begun to consume him quietly. He had destroyed the life of a loyal man for temporary gain, and now the consequences settled in like a storm. He could neither control nor escape. Isaiah, meanwhile, began to understand the unspoken hierarchies within the new plantation. He observed the behavior of other slaves, noting patterns in how they survived, how overseers imposed punishment, and how subtle resistance could make daily life bearable. Each day, he applied his knowledge to guide others without drawing attention, preserving his dignity while extending small protections to those around him. The plantation's harsh labor revealed Isaiah's extraordinary endurance. Fields stretched endlessly. Overseers' eyes were sharp, and the work was exhausting beyond measure, yet he moved with a quiet determination. Others began to rely on him without realizing it. His calm manner, his efficiency, and his patience created a ripple effect. Work that might have broken others became bearable through observation, guidance, and subtle leadership. Edward tried to drown the gnawing guilt with further business ventures. Investments, expansions, and new opportunities demanded attention, yet none of it quieted the memory of Isaiah. Wealth was plentiful, but the moral cost could not be hidden. Each evening, when the house grew quiet, Edward felt the absence of loyalty and service pressing on him. Money had solved immediate problems, but it could not restore what he had destroyed. Margaret often reflected on the moral consequences as well. She understood that her father's wealth had been purchased at a tremendous cost, one that could never be repaid. The family's fortune had expanded, but at the expense of humanity. She witnessed the slow erosion of Edward's pride, replaced by guilt and a growing awareness of his wrongdoing. Isaiah's quiet leadership continued to grow. He taught new arrivals the ways of the plantation, offering subtle guidance on work patterns, safety, and endurance. His moral strength became a stabilizing force among those around him. Even in the face of relentless cruelty, he demonstrated that it was possible to maintain integrity and resilience. His influence, though invisible to the overseers, shaped the daily experience of many and offered a fragile hope in a harsh world. Edward, in contrast, was haunted by the knowledge that he had sold a man of extraordinary loyalty. Every coin earned reminded him of the irreparable loss. Every conversation with Margaret reflected the moral weight of his actions. Wealth could not erase betrayal. Status could not restore trust. The more he tried to immerse himself in business, the more the shadow of his cruelty pressed upon him. Isaiah's endurance was a constant testament to the human spirit. He survived not because the overseers permitted it, but because he refused to allow their cruelty to define him. His days were filled with back-breaking labor, yet each small act of guidance or quiet resistance strengthened those around him. His life had been uprooted, his loyalty betrayed, but his dignity remained intact. Edward's home was a stark contrast. Rooms full of wealth felt hollow. The absence of Isaiah was apparent in every task, every interaction, every quiet corner of the house. The moral debt he carried was heavier than any ledger could account for. His pride, once unassailable, had been worn down by regret. Every glance at Margaret reminded him of what he had lost, and he began to understand the full consequences of choosing profit over loyalty. Isaiah continued to endure, teaching those around him through example rather than words. He preserved his dignity, guided others, and subtly resisted cruelty in ways that were unnoticed by overseers but transformative for those he helped. Survival had become an act of moral defiance. Every day he reminded the people around him, and unknowingly, Edward, that cruelty could destroy comfort, but it could not conquer a steadfast spirit. Edward, in contrast, became increasingly withdrawn. Even in public, the wealth he displayed felt empty. Meals, social gatherings, and business dealings offered no solace. The absence of loyalty, the knowledge of betrayal, and the quiet moral reckoning pressed upon him relentlessly. Every day, the contrast between Isaiah's resilience and Edward's hollow victories became clearer. Margaret observed, spoke when she could, and silently recorded the changes in her father. Pride had given way to reflection. Arrogance had been replaced with a growing awareness of the human cost of cruelty. Edward could no longer ignore the consequences of his actions. He had sold a loyal man for money, and the impact of that cruelty had settled like a shadow over every aspect of his life. Isaiah's influence remained strong among the enslaved workers. Through his patience, wisdom, and quiet guidance, he preserved a sense of hope and dignity. Though removed from the Langston household and betrayed, he had become a pillar of moral strength at the new plantation. His quiet defiance, endurance, and leadership contrasted sharply with Edward's moral decline, highlighting the consequences of cruelty in ways that could not be hidden. Edward, meanwhile, faced each day weighed down by the realization that wealth could not buy conscience. Every action, every business deal, every coin reminded him that cruelty has consequences far beyond immediate gain. The absence of Isaiah in the household left a moral emptiness that could not be filled with money, power, or status. The months continued, and Isaiah's reputation among the slaves grew quietly but unmistakably. He became a source of guidance, a model of resilience, and an example that even in the harshest conditions, human dignity could survive. Edward, despite increasing wealth and influence, could not escape the shadow of his actions. His pride had eroded under the weight of regret, and the house he had filled with possessions remained hollow. Isaiah's quiet endurance taught those around him that cruelty could shape circumstances, but it could never destroy the human spirit entirely. Each day of survival, each subtle act of leadership, reminded him, and everyone who observed him, that loyalty, integrity, and moral strength were beyond the reach of wealth or power. Edward's moral debt continued to grow heavier. Every night in the empty halls, every solitary meal, every glance at Margaret reminded him of what he had sold and betrayed. Money had been gained, but trust, loyalty, and peace had been lost forever. The lesson of cruelty and its consequences pressed upon him relentlessly, shaping his life in ways he could not undo. By the third year, Isaiah's life at the distant plantation had settled into a grim rhythm. The labor was unending, overseers unrelenting, and the fields stretched endlessly under the scorching sun. Every day demanded the utmost endurance, yet Isaiah moved with measured resolve, a quiet defiance that neither chains nor cruelty could diminish. Each day he survived, and in surviving he inspired those around him. Other slaves began to look to him instinctively. His patience in the face of punishment, his careful navigation of overseers' whims, and his ability to complete exhausting work without faltering became a blueprint for survival. Isaiah offered subtle guidance: how to avoid unnecessary lashings, how to conserve energy while meeting impossible quotas, and how to maintain a sense of dignity despite relentless oppression. His moral strength became a silent instruction for those around him. Suffering need not erase integrity. The overseers, meanwhile, began to notice him, not for his compliance, but for his resilience. Whips and threats could not bend him completely, and while they saw only a property to manage, Isaiah's quiet influence unsettled them in ways they could not articulate. He survived, thrived morally, and became a living testament that cruelty could shape circumstance but could never entirely destroy the human spirit. Back at the Langston plantation, Edward felt the void of Isaiah's absence with increasing intensity. Wealth surrounded him, yet every room, every corner, reminded him of what he had sold. Laughter had vanished, replaced by echoes and memory. So even the simplest tasks felt hollow without Isaiah's guiding presence. Each night Edward felt the weight of his actions pressing in, the full cost of his betrayal undeniable. Margaret continued to observe her father closely. She saw the cracks in his pride, the hesitation in his speech, the shadow of regret that clouded his gaze. Edward could still carry himself with authority in public, but privately, the consequences of his cruelty were unavoidable. The memory of selling Isaiah, a man who had served faithfully for decades, haunted him relentlessly. Pride and power had been traded for wealth, but the cost had proven far greater than he had anticipated. Isaiah's letters, delivered sporadically, were carefully worded. He described the daily hardships, the ceaseless labor, and the harsh punishments, but also his methods for enduring them and helping others survive. Each line reflected strength, dignity, and moral clarity. Edward read them with a growing sense of unease. Isaiah's life continued, and though enslaved, he had preserved integrity and even guided others, while Edward remained trapped in the moral consequences of his own choices. At the distant plantation, Isaiah began to take on a more active role in leadership. He instructed new arrivals on survival tactics, guided the younger slaves through back-breaking labor, and taught patience as a form of resistance. Though he could not confront the overseers openly, his quiet influence shaped the lives of many. His resilience became a form of power that the overseers could not touch, a moral victory in a world designed to crush humanity. Edward, by contrast, attempted to drown his guilt in more business ventures, acquisitions, and land expansions, but every transaction, every coin earned, only reinforced the absence of loyalty, trust, and conscience in his life. Wealth surrounded him, yet it offered no relief from the burden of moral debt. The lessons of cruelty and consequence became increasingly unavoidable, and Edward began to understand the permanence of the wrong he had committed. Margaret's observations were silent but potent. Her father's conscience had begun to awaken fully. He no longer ignored the echoes of Isaiah's absence. The house, though full of possessions, felt empty. Edward could not reconstruct what he had destroyed. The man he had sold for profit had survived with dignity, while Edward carried the invisible weight of moral failure with every waking hour. Isaiah's influence was palpable among the enslaved workers. They learned to endure without surrendering entirely, to preserve small measures of dignity, and to support one another in quiet ways. He became a beacon of strength, demonstrating that true endurance is both physical and moral. Even in chains, his presence reshaped the environment, giving hope to those who had none and inspiring resilience in a world built on cruelty. Edward's regret grew deeper with each passing day. Wealth could not fill the hollow silence of the house, nor could it restore the trust and loyalty he had destroyed. Every glance at Margaret reminded him of the betrayal. Every letter from Isaiah highlighted the moral courage he had sold away. The contrast between Isaiah's survival and his own moral decline could not be ignored. Isaiah continued to endure without complaint. He completed the work demanded of him, helped others navigate the cruelty of overseers, and maintained his dignity with every act. His quiet guidance preserved a fragile sense of community and hope. Despite being uprooted and betrayed, he had become a figure of moral authority, demonstrating the resilience of the human spirit in the harshest conditions. Edward's life remained hollow despite his increasing wealth. The house was full of possessions, yet empty of joy. Laughter and loyalty had been replaced by regret and silence. Every coin, every transaction, every new acquisition reminded him that cruelty yields only temporary gain, while moral debt persists indefinitely. Isaiah's presence transformed the plantation in subtle but undeniable ways. Younger slaves learned to observe, emulate, and endure. Acts of guidance, patience, and subtle resistance became common among those around him. His moral strength became a quiet engine of survival for others, ensuring that even under relentless cruelty, integrity and resilience could endure. Edward's conscience could not be ignored. The lessons of cruelty and betrayal pressed down on him daily. He had chosen profit over loyalty, and each day reminded him of the permanent cost. Wealth had been gained, but respect, trust, and peace of mind were lost forever. Every reflection, every quiet moment in the house, reinforced the enduring consequences of his choices. By the end of the 3rd year, the contrast between Isaiah and Edward had become undeniable. Isaiah, despite being enslaved and far from home, had preserved moral strength and quietly guided those around him. Edward, despite wealth, lived under the relentless shadow of regret. The moral cost of cruelty was clear. Money could not restore what had been lost, and the absence of loyalty and conscience left a void that could never be filled. Isaiah's endurance became a quiet legend among the enslaved workers. His actions inspired subtle shifts in behavior, teaching survival under cruelty and the preservation of dignity. Edward, by contrast, could not escape the shadow of regret. The house he had filled with possessions remained hollow, and the absence of loyalty, trust, and moral integrity weighed on him more than any financial burden ever could. As this chapter of their lives drew to a close, it became evident that Isaiah's moral resilience had far outlasted Edward's fleeting gains. Loyalty, integrity, and the strength to endure injustice had left an indelible mark, while cruelty, though temporarily rewarded, had only brought a lasting burden. And so, the story of Isaiah and Edward concludes, a testament to the enduring human spirit and the harsh consequences of betrayal. If you want to see more stories like this, true tales of cruelty, resilience, and historical consequences, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story from America's